Hello and welcome to the Convex Conversation with me, broadcaster Helen Fospero. Today's guest is something of a beauty powerhouse. She started her career in PR in New York, was rapidly headhunted by Estee Lauder before being promoted to Vice President Global Communications of MAC Cosmetics, which she helped turn into the world's biggest makeup brand. Impressive as all of that is, and much as I can't wait to explore some of Michelle's backstory working with global brands, it's what she's doing now that drew me to invite her to guest on our series. Michelle is the founder of Floral Street, a modern, award-winning British fragrance brand, and perhaps the first to place sustainability and eco-responsibility at its very core. And with Black Friday looming, I'll be exploring what Michelle's doing given Black Friday week generates 25% more waste, an excess of 100 million tonnes. Michelle, you really are a force to be reckoned with in the beauty world. I can't actually believe I'm sitting here with you. You also smell beautiful. I presume you're wearing one of your own scents.
Yes, I am.
Tell me more.
Thanks for having me. Oh, today I've got Wild Vanilla Orchid, which in London it's very autumnal today. I think I'm transitioning into that fall fragrance. So yeah, I do wear my own products all the time, and I also do live what I set the brand up for, which is, who will you be today? What are you wearing? What's your mood? Match your scent to your mood.
Oh, it changes your mood so much. We'll come to that in a minute. But let's start with Floral Street and what actually inspired you to start it in the first place?
After 35 years of being in the beauty industry and working across the world, I took a gap year actually at 51.
Did you? I did. A gap year at 51.
I did.
I've never had one.
I didn't have one before that.
No.
I don't know about you, but I took a gap year. I'd been inspired by actually the street name Floral Street in Covent Garden. And I literally looked up one day and thought, what a great name for a fragrance brand. And then I took a gap year at 51 and I really wanted to examine whether I wanted to stay in the beauty industry, whether I wanted to do something else with my life at this point. So I sort of stepped back from everything I knew and just was me, being a mom, doing yoga, reconnecting, literally. And somebody from my industry sent me a package of product and it was so overpackaged. And when you're at home all the time, this is pre-lockdown, so people weren't at home. I unpackaged it all and I just thought, oh my goodness, this is what I need to do. The fragrance industry hasn't looked at itself. It definitely isn't sustainable. There is far too much packaging. Why don't I take a stand? Why don't I make Floral Street this sustainable fragrance brand as much as I can and just go for it and try and make change in the industry? So for my sins, I sort of sat around the dining table. I found a fantastic product development person and started to put mood boards together, and her and I developed the brand and launched it within a year. So
I am quite intrigued about your gap year. Did you just feel at 51, after an extraordinary successful career and very dynamic career, that you just perhaps needed to take a step back and find out who you are or who you are at 51?
Yeah, I definitely needed that. For all of us, I think there's different ways in which you can make space in your life, and it could be in your day. Now, for me, it is in my day. I'd never had time off. I was at Polytechnic in Newcastle in the late 70s, early 80s. And then I'd always worked since 15 in Marks and Spencer's as a Saturday girl. And I'd never actually just stepped back. And, having a second child at 41 and changing countries from America after 13 years to London, moving my son there. It had all built up and I just thought, let's take some space. And what had happened, I'd been in business as the CEO of Saint-Tropez, which was under a private equity holding. And that meant you have quite a stake in the company. And I'd made a chunk of money that I'd never had that kind of money before in my life. And I thought, I've got to use this wisely. For the first time in my life at 51, I can make some maybe bigger choices about who I want to be and how I want to live my life. And so that gap year was just stepping back and literally not going to anything in the beauty industry or fashion industry, just literally being in life and observing. And my two kids at the time taught me as well, a lot about doing nothing. You'll know all about this. But, a teenager can sort of lie on the sofa and just watch a box set and not feel guilty about that. And B, about sustainability. And when you've got a really young child at that time, understanding what recyclable is. I just thought, I'm going to learn from the youth what they want for the future and not what I want. So this space enabled me to observe things and also observe the way the media was changing about what was influencing a consumer or a person. And I found it so valuable to starting my new venture, which was Floral Street.
And of course, you were living in the moment, which is so important, and I'm trying to do much more of, because we lead such busy lives, and I think a lot of us sometimes don't live in the moment. But I'm going to take you right back, because as a little girl, I remember collecting pale pink rose petals from our garden, and I created my own perfumes in old marmalade jars, and they didn't actually smell like perfume, you could imagine. It was just pale pink roses that went off quite quickly. But you had similar experiences when you were little, didn't you?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been really interested in this, but my great-grandmother, my mum's Irish, and I grew up in a big Irish community in Birmingham. And every year we'd go back to Ireland, and she lived in what was rural land almost. And her backyard, she kept pigs, she had lots of plants. But I don't know how she'd managed to do this, but she had gardenia. And this smell, if I close my eyes now and think of gardenia, I'm back there. I'm back to being, the 6-year-old with my great-grandmother in Ireland in the 60s. And that smell. And that's the power that stayed with me all the way through my life, really.
And perfume and scent can definitely affect mood and transport us, I suppose, just like you were transported with that smell of gardenias to your great-grandmother's garden. And that's what you've tried to do, isn't it, with Floral Street?
Yeah, it is, absolutely. I think what I thought was interesting, when I was lucky enough to inherit a brilliant brand in MAC Cosmetics, it was Canadian, and I was in Estee Lauder companies, and I was the first to come in with John Dempsey, who was the president. We migrated it and made it global. But seeing what MAC did for makeup and makeup artistry, I wanted to do that for fragrance and help the individual become a connoisseur of fragrance themselves. And actually, 7 years ago when we launched this, nobody was doing it. Nobody was talking about ingredients. And I've set a bit of a trend, and everybody is now, which is great. But I think it's all about linking into smell. It's the most powerful sense a human has. And I think we've taken it for granted a lot. But we all know if we smell some food, it can transport us back in time or to a different country or a different place. And to use that in the modern world to inspire yourself, comfort yourself, inspire others around you, attract attention, own a room when you want to. I just think it's a fascinating way to think about fragrance, and not just a celebrity fragrance wrapped in cellophane that you're buying in duty free. This is an art form, it's a science form, it's a human form of expression. And I think that's what I wanted to do. I saw the opportunity to maybe change the game.
And also you see scent as almost like a wardrobe. So you don't have to have your signature scent and smell the same every day, because you've done it in such a way where you can choose, even with the little small sample bottles, you can choose who you are that day.
I think I learnt that from MAC as well. It was accessible luxury. Fragrances can be really expensive. I'm not sure it has to be. My industry won't like me saying that. You can create things that are really beautiful. And depending on where you spend the marketing money, like anything, we don't do those big commercials and we don't do those things, but we've got beautiful product. And I think only having a signature scent, something I learned in that gap year, a lot of people, because it is so expensive, say, I keep it for best. Oh my goodness, I'm just in my 60s now. I'm not keeping anything for best. It's all getting used, the cutlery, the crockery. But you should have the joy of fragrance every day. So what I wanted to do was create a wardrobe. And our wardrobe that we've just launched is 30 quid to get 12 fragrances, 2 mils. It means you can make a choice. You can experiment. You can wear it for a day, see if you like it. So that was my whole reason for doing this company, was to help educate the consumer about smell, to give them choice at an affordable price, and to not sell you something that you've paid too much for and you keep it on the shelf and you only use it for best.
How do you go about creating your scents in the first place? And I'm guessing you're working with a world-class nose somewhere along the way.
Yeah, that was the other thing. A lot of people pretend to be noses, the head companies in my world, but I'm not the expert. So luckily, Jérôme Epinette, who is a master perfumer, which takes years. So if you imagine to be a perfumer, it probably takes 7 years. You have to know 5,000 ingredients and then you start your career. So I was lucky enough to be introduced to him in New York. I literally just was like, do you think you'd be interested in my brand? And I went to New York with mood boards and sat in a room with him, and he was inspired about doing the project. And now we work really closely together on all the new fragrances. And it starts with an idea, and then he makes that come to life, that idea, with his wonderful combinations of ingredients and skill.
What idea do you start with, and where do you take your inspiration from?
The one which is really clear, I mean, first of all, when I started the brand, I set up mood muses. How we all might feel as females, predominantly, it was at the beginning, but you have those rock royalty nights where you're kind of wanting your leather trousers on and you might be going out to a gig. So I'd put those mood boards together, and then he interpreted that as a smell. But before lockdown, I'd done some big traveling. I'd gone to Australia to launch Floral Street. I flew back via San Francisco, and then I flew to New York and then back to England. And I was going across the desert, and I was flipping through a magazine, and it had all this sort of fringing and cowboy hats in. And I thought, oh, urban cowgirl. So I held on to that thought. Then I went to Chile, to the Atacama Desert, and hiked across salt flats. And I'm like,
beautiful.
This is it. High altitude, blue skies, freedom, urban cowgirl. Jerome, we've got to do this fragrance. And he created Arizona Bloom, which is this spectacular, it's our #1 fragrance now in the UK. And he actually has created this natural high in a fragrance, which I find fascinating.
It's great that he can take your ideas and then interpret them. But you're also inspired by Van Gogh and the sunflowers, weren't you, too? Which I love the packaging of.
Thank you. This is where the sustainability drew a lot of attention. We were the first to create a pulp box for fine fragrance. And my husband said to me, what are you putting that beautiful bottle in that pulp box for? And I was like, you just wait and see. The tide is turning. And we went to a company in the Lake District, a paper mill, and said, can we work with you and make a box? Anyway, we made the box, launched the brand. I took a store in Covent Garden, which was a big risk, big punt, high rent, but I wanted to make a statement. And the person who is the founder of a company in Australia called Mecca Beauty, which is massive, came into the store and said, I want to take you to Australia. And I was like, oh my God, no, we've only been open a week. And she's like, you're coming. So the sustainability aspect of the brand opened the door to wider distribution.
So a pulp box, does that mean, you'll have to excuse my ignorance here, Michelle, does that mean something that will compost and go into the soil and not cause any harm?
But what we did was we worked with a company that was actually, they take water from, they're on the sustainability level super, super high because they're in the Lake District, so they have to adhere. So it's solar powered. We're using waste from coffee cups to go into that box. It's 1 cup recycled from McDonald's and things like that. They're one of the few facilities in the world, actually, that can extrude plastic from because when you buy a coffee in a paper cup, there's plastic in there. So they can take the plastic out and use the paper. So it was a whole circular change, really, and nobody was doing it. And now we've led, and a lot of people are doing it in our industry as well, which I'm very happy for.
And what drove you to put sustainability and responsibility for our planet at the very heart of what you're doing?
I just didn't see the point in doing anything else if I wasn't going to do that, because when I took the gap year, the world doesn't need any more products. And that was the questions I was asking myself. So because I had been so involved in, the MacAIDS Fund and seeing how beauty could actually make a difference and change things, whatever I was going to do had to have an element of trying to change for the good. So we began to think about packaging, which is the biggest challenge. And when you have a challenge, you'll create something. If it's not there, you have to go out and create it.
So that really drove you at that point.
That did drive me, yeah.
And of course, Black Friday is almost upon us. One of the year's busiest shopping times when we all get a bit carried away. In fact, I've already been carried away a bit discount-wise because Black Friday week seems to start. It seems to be Black Friday month,
now.
really.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
I was quite staggered when I was chatting to you, Michelle. It's predicted that British consumers will spend a total of 3.8 billion this year. That's just in that week. And that's a staggering 800 million more than last year. But this kind of shopping frenzy has a massive impact on the planet, doesn't it?
The waste, the frenzy of my beauty industry at creating and newness and selling and discounting. And look, I've got a brand I have to play into some of these. Otherwise, you can't stay in business. But what we've done, we work with this amazing charitable organisation called Clean Hub. And the founder I met a couple of years ago, he's based out of Berlin, and he makes it his business to companies where the waste is in the ocean, collect it, recycle it properly. And what we're doing this Black Friday is for every product we sell, we are paying for another kilo of ocean waste to be collected. And what I love about that, look, we're still creating waste, so I can't pretend any other way, but this organisation, Clean Hub, actually facilitates women's groups around the world. So we particularly are linked to something called Greenworms, which is a collective in Kerala in India. And these women have been given great facility training. They've even mobilized themselves to start collecting waste from homes in their area before it gets to the ocean. So we actually are seeing how supporting education and a collective of women, once you start supporting women, can change the world just that little bit more. And I think if we look at Black Friday month, if we look at all the advent calendars that are out there that in beauty, you look at the packaging and the waste. I would urge everybody to just look at what you are doing with that during this season.
And of course, when you were at places like MAC, I was a bit of a MAC addict, especially in my television days when it was all our favourite brand. But I do remember donkeys years ago collecting the empty lipstick. And if you took X amount of lipstick cases, three, then you get a new product. So presumably some of what you're bringing to your new brand now, some of those learnings perhaps came from working with brands like MAC, did they?
I think my career I've learned something new from every different brand and every different experience I've had with my career. And I always call it storing the idea. If you think about your head as a little filing cabinet, and in the back of the filing cabinet, I'm like, store that. And what I wanted to do with Floral Street was bring many of the learnings and elements that I have had and bring those to being and create something beautiful. Look, beauty should be beautiful. Don't take the beauty out of beauty. But if we as a company can do that little more to make it easier for the consumer to behave better from a sustainability standpoint, then why not? So even where we trace our ingredients from, we know where they come from, that they're sustainably sourced. A lot of, if you imagine, a lot of the farms are small holdings, like one of the peppers is a collective of women in the foothills of the Himalayas. We're supporting little communities, but what the company we work with, Weather Knows Robertet, actually sustain that community all year. So they're not just saying, oh, give us your flowers or give us your peppers and we'll see you next year. They're actually supporting those communities all year round. So everything I've done with this brand is look at, as far as I can, where I can start and finish to help bring the consumer a beautiful product, a fine fragrance that has a recyclable package or compostable package, and do the work for them.
And have you been and visited some of these communities?
We launched the brand in 2019 and then, of course...
And then we closed it.
2018-19. But next year we're planning to go down to meet with the group Greenworms in India and do some filming and some first-hand.
They sound incredible. Yeah. And I just found a little stat here when you're talking about Clean Hub. They're dedicated to freeing the planet from plastic pollution, but they've helped retrieve so far the equivalent of 230,000 half-litre plastic bottles from reaching our oceans. And that in itself is quite an achievement, isn't it?
It is. And the founder, we did a litter pick as well with them last year. So we went to the East End and we went all around there. I was horrified to find out, it's all learning, horrified to find out that even cigarette stubs have got plastic in them. And we did this litter pick. He came over from Berlin and he said, I can't seem to get any of the bigger beauty companies to get on board with us. He said it's been all small entrepreneurial companies that are engaging in this. So I think there's a swell underneath, I'm hoping, of companies that find each other and start to work and learn from each other, even if it's in a different category, really.
You are, I would say, a trailblazer in fragrance in the way that you're operating your company, but are you already teaming up with some like-minded brands?
Yes, and you talked about the Van Gogh coming back circular, but they came to us and said, we love what you're doing with sustainability, the Van Gogh Museum, and would you consider partnering with us? And again, it was at the beginning of the brand, and I'm like, oh my God, this is too big. And my head of marketing said, no, we've got to do this, and we did. And I went to the museum and I could choose any painting in the museum.
Oh, wow.
And it's on our bottle and it's on our box because they looked at what we were doing from a sustainability standpoint, like Mecca did. And in fact, next weekend, I'm invited to a dinner at the Van Gogh Museum. They've used us as a sort of a best-in-class partner with them. And we've got a dinner in the museum. But I went to the museum. We had access to letters that Van Gogh wrote. And by linking with them, they can tell our story a little bit more. We tell their story a bit more. And it all starts to add up. And then you start to find your community and then you start to make some change.
That's an extraordinary connection. And when they said to you, you can choose any painting, was it really obvious to you that it had to be the sunflowers?
It was, because with my creative head, went to the museum and thought, oh, shall I choose something abstract? But then when you think about if you want to make a successful fragrance, number one, and Sunflowers by Van Gogh is recognised globally. So I was being smart about, the positivity of sunflowers and fragrance, but also about recognition. And if people recognise sunflowers and as being Van Gogh, they might be drawn to our brand. So it worked really well. And then since then, we've done almond blossom painting as well. And we're in the museum shops. I mean, how wonderful is that for a founder to be able to see that?
I'm afraid I'm a bit of a geek, and one of my favourite haunts in life are museum shops. I love a museum shop. That's amazing that you did that. What did Jerome say when you rang and said, OK, the Van Gogh painting is your inspiration this time?
He was wowed, actually, and he imagined himself in a field of sunflowers in the south of France where Van Gogh would have painted, and imagined the passing of the day, and therefore made the ingredients move as if it was the passing of the day, with a Bellini accord in the centre and a vegan honeyed accord on the top. And it was just magnificent, really. And he actually went to the museum during lockdown because he was in France and they could go to be filmed in front of the painting. So how incredible is that?
When you create something with Jerome, does he then call you when he thinks that he's got the right, the mixture is probably not the right word at all in the perfume world, but can you then tweak and say that you'd like those notes to be a little stronger? I'm getting there, aren't I? Notes is a perfume
Very good.
word.
It's a perfume word, yeah. But yes, we can. Usually he's spot on, to be honest. And we've got a major collab coming up next year, which is extremely exciting on a global level. And he was so inspired by that. His first stab at the fragrance, he sent 10. 10! And we're like, oh my goodness, they're all good. But yeah, so much goes into fragrance, so much art, science, collecting ingredients from around the world. That's why sustainability more than anything is really important along the way.
And the connection perhaps back to nature and flowers and things that nature gives us.
Yes, definitely. I mean, the joy of that. Men are so interested in fragrance as well now, which is great. So it is having a moment. I think post-pandemic, people during the pandemic realised they had a sense of smell and that it was important. We're working from home a little bit more. They were realising how important it is to sort of make your environment really smell good.
Take us back a bit again. How did you end up in beauty in the first place? Had it always appealed or did you stumble into it?
I've never actually had a plan in life.
You're so like me. I didn't have a plan either.
No, I think I've just been very open to the journey. I moved to London in 1984 and I had fashion student roommates in Newcastle and they said, come work in London. And then I did for no money. And then I had a bed sit in Archway. I was on £55 a week, I seem to remember.
Glamorous times.
Glamorous times, the 80s, but very well dressed. Part of the clients that Leslie Goring, who was my first boss, had was Trevor Sorby, who unfortunately recently passed away. And I started to work with that account and him in particular. I went to Boots with him and we presented products to sell to Boots. And it was the first ever professional hair care line to sell into Boots. And I had a flip chart. There was no computers, no big swizzy presentations. And I just got really interested in how fashion influenced beauty, how beauty was a much more tangible way of creating business and affecting people's lives on a daily basis, and how the whole thing worked together. And he then asked me to come in-house with him. So that was my second role. Then Lynn Frank said, oh my goodness, I was at a party in the 80s, as we all were, and I met somebody from Lynn Frank's. We want somebody to develop a beauty division for us. So off I went again. And I just got a love for beauty and also how it affects the daily lives of a person, how it can really make you feel better about yourself. How it can become your armor if you're in business as a woman, particularly in the 90s in New York, your lipstick, your fragrance, you've
got to rock it, haven't you?
You've got to rock it when you're in
that decade.
And then I just took a risk, and my boyfriend at the time was in the music industry. He said, do you want to move to New York? And off I went with £600 and 2 people to contact. And then I ended up again, Bumble and Bumble became my first client. I just set up my own company there, and off I went and ended up heading up all the PR. I launched Club USA. I had the limelight. It was just this incredible world of opportunity, and where art and nightlife and music was then becoming the big influence in beauty as well as fashion. And I just was open to whatever would come. And then I got headhunted into Lauder.
That must have been incredible. What was it like working for a brand like that? In the names you've just mentioned, Trevor Sorby came into GMTV a lot in my GMTV days.
Oh, yeah.
Lynn Frank's legendary in the PR world. But Lauder is right up there in terms of beauty and makeup. What was it like working for such an international, powerful brand?
It was amazing. So I'd become a single mom, actually, and my own company was growing. And then they called me and said, we know you've got your own company. Would you talk to us? They were still privately owned then, so they didn't have all the brands they've got now. And I said, okay, yeah, I'm sure. 10 interviews I had. 10, including Leonard Lauder himself.
Really?
Oh, yeah. And at the end, there was this amazing woman called Jeanette Wagner who had completely built the international side of Estee Lauder, the brand. And she had launched previously to that Cosmopolitan around the world. Incredible woman. And I thought, wow. And I said, excuse me, Miss Wagner, is this the last interview? And she said, why are you asking? I said, I've got no more outfits to wear. And she said, welcome to Estee Lauder. And I said, I haven't said yes. And she said, you will. And then I entered this world. I got whizzed up to the 42nd floor. I had an office overlooking Manhattan. And I'm only like 32, 33 with a child, and thinking, oh my God, they don't know I'm from Birmingham. It was really sort of strange. And then I learned so much. It was like going to Harvard Business School for beauty, and they had a saying, good work equals more work. So I did a great job on prescriptives. They then gave me Tommy Hilfiger brand. They were just launching. They then became a publicly listed company and were buying more brands. Leonard said, we want you for your entrepreneurial skill. I think it's called intrapreneurial when you go into a company. But I then got given a pot of cream called Creme de la Mer, and they said, see what you can do with that. And I launched that. And that was a big rolling success. And what I loved about working for them, there was excellence was what they required. Excellence in every way. And if you couldn't achieve that, then you just shouldn't be there. And I loved needing to be excellent. And the fact that a good idea wasn't beaten down, it was cherished, it was talked around the table. And I was sitting with senior managers, we're talking millions. Then with MAC, I launched 40 countries. It was amazing. And then we got it to 1 billion. You know, people are talking billions there around the table. And you're just observing and watching and learning from each other and learning about product development. And it was the most amazing time, really professionally for me.
But how did you manage to jiggle all of that? In the daytime, you're in this dynamic world and you're talking in the billions and you're talking about products like Creme de la Mer, which I only had about 2 pots of because it was so eye-watering expensive. I hope you had unlimited Creme de la Mer,
yes,
which is what I would have
absolutely.
absolutely killed for. But how did you manage a young child and being a single mum at the same time? Was it a real juggle?
You're a mum. You have no choice, A. First of all, I had my son without medical insurance in America. So that was my wake-up call. This is never going to happen to me again, right? I'm never going to not have medical insurance. So the birth of my son actually was the driving force to me being super ambitious and successful. And, you know, when I split from his father, instead of crying and coming home, I thought, look, I've created something here. I've got to go for it. And what I learned to do was invest in myself via getting really good help, like a nanny, an apartment that was pretty central, and that I could get back to him within 15 minutes. And I didn't have much money left after that, but it was about investing in yourself to grow your career, because I knew if I grew my career, I wouldn't have to worry about what money I had. And I had extremely supportive boss in John Dempsey at the time for Matt when I was doing most of the traveling. And anywhere we could, my son came with. And so I had lots of Post-it notes, lots of cooking at weekends to make sure, you know, I'd try and drop him to school every day. And I'd be out at night as well. So it was sort of a real juggle. But I loved it. I loved the intensity of it. He probably didn't get as much of me as he should have when he was younger. But once he got to 16, I could explain that I had to do this if we wanted the life we wanted. So I don't regret any of that. And I had endless energy at that point, you know.
I'm sure you gave him things that you don't even realise, because my children were both very resilient. I had to go back to work when Francesca was 6 weeks old. Oh. I was presenting and I wasn't staff. And so I had no maternity leave. And at the time, I was the main breadwinner. And GMTV called second time in my career when I was actually in New York for a visit. And my son was 11 weeks and it was too good an opportunity. So I remember picking Jack out of his crib at 3:30 in the morning, feeding him because I was still feeding him myself, popping him back in his crib at 4 a.m. and there'd be a cab outside and I'd head off to GMTV. And I think you sound very much like me, Michelle. Yeah. When these things happen, you just get on with it. And I don't have any regrets when I look back at that time. And my kids are very resilient and independent. And it was actually quite good fun. It was hard work, but I was organised like you.
We weren't in positions where we're getting up in the middle of the night to go and clean an office. I just made a choice. Like you, I went back to work after Harry after 1 week because it was my company and I lived in America, and who was going to do the work if it wasn't me, sort of thing. But he would come with me. And in fact, when I took the gap year, both my kids were like, please, can you go back to work?
And one thing I did want to touch on, just because I remember it so vividly, you were responsible for some incredible campaigns. And I'm thinking MAC now, the MAC AIDS Fund and Viva Glam initiatives. Tell us a bit about those, because some of our listeners won't be familiar with those campaigns, and how you realised that you could create a broader social awareness and change through makeup and beauty.
Number one, I'd always had a little bit of a internal fight about, I was raised Catholic, and it was this internal fight about success versus doing good. And then when I got into Estee Lauder companies, the first campaign I was involved with was Mrs. Lauder's Pink Ribbon. She had created that campaign and decided to raise money via her company to fund research, and all of us in the company had to get involved.
Into breast cancer.
Yeah, breast cancer, that was, Pink Ribbon. So I was like, this is amazing. So this is what you do when you make success. This is how you give back via your company. And I'm talking mid-90s here. And then when we inherited MAC, the original owners, Frank and Frank from Toronto, had set up the MAC AIDS Fund. So it already had a bit of traction, and they'd signed RuPaul to be their first spokesperson, who's now hugely successful, obviously. And I was like, this is amazing. Let's take this and let's make it even more successful. And what I did was I got very involved in the challenges of AIDS at that time. So women of colour in America, it was rising. So I said, let's sign Mary J. Blige. And John said, let's put Little Kim in there. And nobody wanted to sign Mary J. at that time because she had a little bit of a history. And we signed her and we used her voice to reach the right consumer for that. And it was genuine. 100% of the sales of that lipstick went to the AIDS Fund. And then I learnt about being a pass-through organisation. So by the time we were really raising money, I went to the United Nations and knocked on the door and said to the UNDP and said, are we allowed to give you money? And they were like, come on in. And the next thing I know, I'm sitting at a board table and I'm on a committee for AIDS in Africa. And I'm with all these, Africans from all different countries. And I start talking about how do we communicate? Do we do videos? And they pretty much laugh me out the room. They're like, no, we have to sing. We have to send people to villages. We have to sing. We have to do it in a different way. And so we engage sort of world musicians. And one of the highlights of my entire life and professionally was having Mary J. Blige perform in that big General Assembly room at the United Nations. And we presented a check to Kofi Annan at the time to kick off an initiative for American companies to give to AIDS in Africa.
That's extraordinary. You made the hairs on the back of my arm stand up saying that. I bet that was an incredible moment. And how much difference did it make? How did people engage around the world with the campaign? How successful was it?
Yeah, then I ended up meeting Bill Clinton in his organisation. I learned from that about how you can mobilise people around you. And it takes multiple levels. It takes some commerce. It takes some change in the law. It takes some change in attitudes. But you really can make a difference. And beauty on a very basic level, a lipstick has so much power around the world, I can't tell you. And to be able to truly give, and the Lauder Corporation at that time committed to keeping that on around the world. So everywhere I went to launch MAC, in China, I had to deal with the authorities because they didn't want to be as open about the challenges they had with AIDS. So I met with a bunch of guys in uniforms. In India, we took Linda Evangelista to Mumbai. We visited a brothel. We did big stories with media. And we raised the awareness and gave $250,000 to kick off building a hospital. So I just was able to realise the power that beauty has to do good. So now when I see so many brands that are just creating lots of waste and TikTok, and it's all a bit crazy to me, I think, where is the person doing some good with what they're raising and doing?
Because it's so possible, isn't it,
it's
to do
so
good at the same time. What did you do with Bill Clinton? I met him once and thought he was very twinkly.
He was very charming, wasn't he?
Very charming, very beautiful eyes, actually, and very nice.
I'm sure he loved you as he loved me at that time, a young English blonde girl. But he just founded his foundation, and it was based in Harlem. And MAC was all races, all ages, all sexes. And I suggested to William Lauder at the time and that we opened a store in Harlem and that I get Mary J to do that. And because we were working with AIDS, so he invited us up to his offices and we met him. And I actually think if I hadn't have moved back to London, that I was in the process of, I probably would have gone and worked in his foundation or something, because I think my career was about to sort of deviate at that point if I hadn't have moved back to London.
You haven't moved. Gosh, what extraordinary experiences. And also you pioneered a Prince's Trust collaboration in the UK when you were with Saint-Tropez, didn't you?
I did, yeah. It was about self-esteem, and I put a beauty group together and we raised a lot of money for the Prince's Trust via that group. And that's an amazing organisation, absolutely amazing. So everything I do, I try and have a link to some form of giving back in a really true way, a really cohesive way, not just slapping a brand name on something. So the Prince's Trust, I got to meet, who now is the King, obviously, but his organisation is just so inspirational about how it takes people. And there was a huge group of individuals that particularly women who were often single mums that wanted to start a little beauty business from their home. And the Prince's Trust became the supporter of that. So, there was a real sense of we were giving to something truly authentic about how it was changing people's lives.
I think the King has real vision, doesn't he? When you think about all the work he does and the understanding he's got about people trying to make their mark and to get started in life, it's wonderful that he can see that, given the world that naturally he inhabits.
Somebody just needs to believe in you, right? I mean, I've always had these incredible experiences where somebody's believed in me and given me an opportunity. And talking about Trevor Sorbie, I bumped into him a few years ago and I said, I just wanted to thank you for giving me the opportunity to learn from you all those years ago. And he went, now look at you. He was like, I should learn from you. But I think saying thank you to those that help you grow, that show you a different way. It's a different workplace now, potentially. I want to give that now back if somebody wants it. This has been the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, is to start a brand from scratch. Nobody'd heard of it. It's my investment. It's the hardest thing I've ever done in my professional career.
And in some ways, is it perhaps the most rewarding?
I don't know yet.
It's too early to say.
It's too early. But yes, I'm still learning. Look, I'm learning every day. I'm having to be a different leader. And it becomes your child, another child, really. I'm sure with your podcast, it's the same.
Yeah. I know it is. And yes, it certainly is. We often end our chats, Michelle, talking about risk. And I just wondered, what's the biggest risk that you've ever taken in life? And it can be a personal risk or your business life, anything really. What's the biggest risk?
I guess I don't think of risk, weirdly. So yes, maybe staying in New York was taking a risk on myself when I had my son and we split. I could have gone home. So that risk on myself that I took was probably the biggest if I look back. But also risking starting something and launching it at age 53 when it's new territory is also another risk. But whenever I consider making a decision like that, I just say, what's the worst that can happen? And if I can live with that, I jump. If you think about life like that, what's the worst that can happen? And I go for it. And I guess risk hasn't, obviously I wouldn't jump off a bridge, or I'm not on about that, but life risks. And if you don't risk, you don't gain, really.
No, it's been such a treat to sit and talk to you today. You've worked for all my favourite brands, and it's wonderful to hear you talk about taking your gap year at 51, which makes me realise that in my late 50s, it's not too late to take my gap year. And it's great to see you doing something different. And also, it was the sustainability side that really drew me. I started reading about Floral Street and thought, who's behind it? And then, of course, saw your backstory and realised it was you, who I'd obviously heard of in the past. And I thought, gosh, we need Michelle on the podcast. So thank you for coming in. It's been a real treat. And yes, you've made the studio smell rather beautiful. I think our editor's going to be asking for something of that because it smells absolutely delicious in here. But great to talk to you, Michelle, and good luck with everything you're doing.
Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to Floral Street founder Michelle Feeney talking about her life in beauty and the importance of taking care of our planet. Download and subscribe to our series at convex.podbean.com or search The Convex Conversation. We're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to yours. I'll be back next week with another guest who probably won't be smelling quite as nice as Michelle, so join me then.